Today we are going to talk about engagement surveys. My name is Cody Lawson. I have been with Bloomerang for 7 years, basically since the doors opened. So if you are a longtime customer, you may have interacted with me in one of my numerous roles. I've been the assistant to the CEO. I've been the controller. I've done marketing. I've done support. I've done conversions. I've done quality assurance. And now I've kind of settled into what I think is more my final role as a product manager. I live in Denver. I was already a remote employee, so lucky me, I didn't have too big of an adjustment over the past few months. Like I said, I live in Denver. This is my wife. We like to travel. We went to Peru. We can't travel right now. That makes me sad. So I'm going to do an academy class instead. It's about equal comparison. So other things about me. Before I was working at Bloomerang, I was an attorney. I did healthcare law for 5 years. Worked with a lot of hospitals doing physician hospital contracts, reimbursement appeals, things of that nature. And prior to that, I worked at the Indiana Hospital Association as their legislative intern, which is a nonprofit that represents the hospitals in Indiana. I also have a dog. I think that it's kind of a requirement that during the pandemic that you show off your animal. So there's Oliver. He will not be like some of the cats that I've seen on some of these videos where he'll jump in the way. So that'll be the only time that you'll see him unless he decides to start barking. Last thing, I am a huge Liverpool soccer club fan. So I'm very excited because they won the Premier League. And so as you can see, even when I travel, I'm wearing my Liverpool stuff. Decided not to don it today though. So with that, let's turn to the class at hand here. The goal today, at its core, what we are trying to do here is gain a deeper understanding of your constituents. We want to empower them to provide you with feedback, which then you can turn around into improving your donors' loyalty, their engagement, and your retention. So let's start out with a big problem. So only about a third of first-time donors will ever make a second gift to you. So do me a quick favor and just kind of think about your first-time donors who have lapsed over the past year. I am going to quickly pull over a Bloomerang database, and I will show you how one way depending on if you have a custom donor retention wheel or you have different ways that you track your donor retention, this may not work exactly for you, but because Bloomerang puts donor retention and donor engagement front and center, here is one way that you can very quickly find out who your first-time donors are that have lapsed. Go to your donor retention wheel and click on the light colored one. That will bring up a picture, the report of all of your lapsed donors. You can see there are 132 here. And then if you add a filter, we've got this has transaction filter. If you change that to has at most one transaction, then that would reduce your results down to only first-time donors because they would obviously only have one donation with you. And that can show you that, see, out of those 100, however many it was, 32 of those are lapsed. And in this case, that's almost $1,300 for this organization. Not necessarily reflective, again, of your situation, but it's important to be able to identify who your first-time donors are and be able to find a list of those, especially as it relates to this survey class. So think about those first-time donors who have lapsed over the past year. And I have two questions to kind of present to you. Why did they make their first gift? And then the second one is, why did they lapse? So keep those in mind. Do you have answers for those? You may or may not. And then sort of more generally, don't forget about your existing donors. While retained donors have a higher retention rate year over year, there are still important questions that you need to consider with your existing donors, like, are you providing them with good donor service? Are they still passionate about your mission? Do you communicate well with them? Are there feelings towards your organization and your team potentially specifically? Are those feelings growing? So keeping those in mind, I'm going to shift over to the actual presentation part, but this is your one chance to be interactive, so take advantage of it. I'm going to present you with a pick your acronym because everybody loves or hates acronyms. So I thought I would give you the opportunity to select what you think is the best acronym for breaking down my presentation. So the presentation is in 3 parts. And here is option 1. Part 1, background and data. Part 2, setup and surveying. And part 3, stewardship. So this acronym is known as BAD SaaS. You've got option 2, which is data and descriptions, surveying, and then making our moves successful, or dad's moms. And then the third one, it's very hard to actually come up with acronyms, especially when you have it already broken down into specific categories. So this one's a little bit of a throwaway, but I like the acronym. Why it matters, surveying, and then your turn. So that makes the acronym WHIMSY. So now I'm going to give you the opportunity to select your favorite. I'll let this go for about 30 seconds or so, and then we'll see what we get. So, bad SaaS, dad's moms, and whimsy. Then John, whenever you think that the voting has waned a little, you can present the responses.
That was an active poll. There were 82 votes, and Bad Sass got 50%, but Whimsy was close at 39%. Dad's Moms was kind of the lowest, but it looks like Bad Sass wins.
All right, Bad Sass. All right, great. Okay. So the poll was actually intended to be a little bit more useful than just a lighthearted moment where you can interact with me. But because I didn't know what would be the most popular answer, I had to make up my own just normal style breakdown of the 3. I could have guessed, but then it would have been very embarrassing if I were wrong. And engagement surveys are similar in a way. Going back to the question I asked earlier, or the questions I asked earlier, don't guess these answers. It's a bad idea to guess, even if you guess right. And in this case, I actually guessed right because I thought that Bad Sass would win. Even if you guessed right, there were still 50% or so that did not want Bad Sass or preferred something else. So there's still a percentage that I would be wrong, even if you know or you could guess why half of your first-time donors lapsed, you're still then guessing wrong about the other 50%. So keeping that in mind, here are the actual 3 sections. I made them much simpler, so you can call them bad SAS if you want, but the first section is data. So why do donors lapse? This is what do we know about your donors? The second section is the surveying part, the Bloomerang feature, setting up the surveys and viewing, reviewing, and tracking the responses. I will show you some of that stuff. I'm not going to spend too much time on that, mostly because, as I'll get into later, the point is not for you to spend an exorbitant amount of time setting these up, customizing them. They're intended to be very simple to set up, set it and forget it. You don't have time to be doing all of that. We took care of the heavy lifting for you. And then the third section is going to kind of tie back some of these other ones into actions. What do you do with the information that we've provided to you? So a brunt of the presentation is going to be on data. What do we know? So breaking down the data section, I want to focus on 2 main factors. There's the reason behind donors leaving. Why do donors lapse? And then the second one is what goes into having donor loyalty, retained donors, somebody who's committed and would be retained for year over year and not lapse. And then I'm going to take that information and I'm going to organize it. Initially, I wasn't going to include these 4 categories at this point, thinking that I'd bring them up later when I could more fully explain them. But sometimes I've found that it's good to introduce a concept, or in this case, a group of terms, categories, that you can just kind of put in the back of your mind and know that they're going to come back later. And as I go through these different data points, you can just kind of mentally organize them and know that they're going to come back. So organizing the data that I present in these previous 2 areas into the ideas of trust, commitment, satisfaction, and intimacy. So why donors leave? This was a question that Dr. Adrian Sargeant, who is a giant in the donor retention, donor loyalty, donor engagement sphere, he is the man, so to speak. He did a study where he surveyed lapse donors and worked to understand why they gave and why they stopped giving. So before I get into why they leave, let's jump back to the earlier question about why they first gave. So this study found that there are some main reasons that trend toward a donor first giving to an organization. And those primary reasons are that the organization has a good reputation. So this is your brand. The second thing is the affinity for the cause. So this is your mission. This is what you are trying to do to benefit the world in some way. And then the third thing is that you have good or professional management of the organization. So this is your team. These are your volunteers. These are your board members. These are the faces of your organization. So that's the primary set of reasons why they give in the first place. So then, why do they leave? So the first thing that is worth noting is that there may be more than one reason why a donor lapses. And in all honesty, there are typically multiple reasons. So for that reason, that is why those percentages on the left exceed 100, because it may be a combination of being able to afford as well as thinking that others may be more deserving. So again, that's important to recognize that there are multiple factors. So kind of going back again to my earlier question, if you answered that question, why did they leave, and you had a single answer, that may only be part of the answer, even if you were correct in one sense. So I also want to point out that this could be the most important slide of the presentation. So I'm not going to bury the lead here, because what you're seeing here, what I have boxed, you have at least some control over all of those outlined items. Now, certainly death, and I believe that in this case, it also included relocation. Certainly you don't have control over if somebody dies. And in the sense of relocation, you may not have much control over that, especially if you're a very local nonprofit, that the person moves away. Maybe they want to be able to support the same type of cause, but in their new local community. But in general, that death one is no control. Sorry, can't help you there. But if you look at these other ones, I think that you, if nothing else, would admit that you have at least some control over them. So let's start and look at a couple of these quickly. The main reason, can no longer afford. So you may be thinking, well, if they can't afford to donate anymore, how is that under my control? And so this is a tricky one, because, like I said, there are multiple reasons that can be involved. And the studies suggest that lapse donors don't tend to be lost to the nonprofit sector as a whole. So they tend to shift their support from one cause to another. And this is especially true when the donation is a small percentage of that donor's giving. So let me clarify, though. When I say a small percentage, that doesn't mean that they have given you a small amount. It just means that out of the total allocated giving that they have, if a small percentage of that total is associated with your organization, it is more likely that that donation is subject to being moved around to different causes. Because the other thing about donors is that they tend to support more than one cause. So that kind of brings me to then the second most popular one that others are more deserving. This is mostly under your control. Certainly there are things that, become causes of the moment, natural disasters, things of that nature where, the Red Cross or something like that. Those kinds of things are not necessarily within your control, but at the same time, what you have control over is your organization, your messaging. And so being able to deliver on why your organization has the need is part of what is under your control, and what I'll get into a little bit more later. And the rest of these are what I have dubbed the finger wagging ones. These are things that probably shouldn't be happening and are almost entirely under your control. So things like never getting thanked for donating, cardinal sin, in my opinion. What we have promoted repeatedly and what we have shown consistently is that thanking your donor is one of the most important things in making sure that that donor feels obviously appreciated. That's what thanking's for, as well as becoming more engaged in your organization and increasing the likelihood of giving again. That's why we put out the first time donor call list on the dashboard. That's why we have acknowledgement emails. That's why we put out lots and lots of academy classes, blog posts, etc. on thanking donors. No memory of supporting. That's kind of a baffling one, and yet almost 1 out of 10 use that as a reason why they left. No information on how the money is used. This goes back to a number of things that we talk about in some of our other classes and education materials. People want to know how their money is used, and these all tie in later on with the surveys. And then the thought that charity didn't need them. Again, I think that's a messaging issue that it's really important that you explain how important each and every donation is and be able to personalize it so the person understands how critical even their small donation is to your overall goals and achieving them. So then a couple additional noteworthy items that I haven't put on here about Lapse donors. And like my earlier point about the acronym, I would caution you against making assumptions or drawing conclusions about your donors based on these items that I'm going to mention. It's not a good idea to overly stereotype. We talk about segmenting your donor database, like your outreach and stuff, but you don't want to necessarily stereotype these different conclusions. There's simply things to keep in mind as you cultivate your new donors and as you're learning more about them. So some additional things about the Lapse donors. They tended to indicate that there was at least some initial pressure or obligation to make their donation. Family pressure, community pressure, social media pressure, whatever the case may be. Additionally, their initial affinity for the mission or the organization was less than those who were remaining active donors. Kind of makes sense. If you're not as invested in the mission, seems likely that you would be less inclined to stick around. Also, Lapse donors tend to skew younger. This also can make sense. Younger people do have less disposable income. Also, younger people, I would say, tend to be a little bit more agile when it comes to their interests and their focus at any one moment in time. So that may be one of the reasons that, the others may be more deserving, whatever the case may be. And then the last one is if a donor regards religion as a very important factor, that donor is significantly more likely to lapse. This may seem counterintuitive on its face, and this is not intended to be a judgment about people who are or are not religious as a component of their life. But the thing to keep in mind generally about people who are highly religious is that the community of their religion tends to also play an influential role in what they may consider to be worthy causes or worthy endeavors at any one moment in time. So it may seem counterintuitive that organizations that tend to be more charitable as a characteristic of that organization, that the influence of that may cause them to shift their focus. So that was a lot of information, I realize, but here are the takeaways for why donors leave. So they initially support the organization because they have a favorable perception of the organization, mission, and management. The outward perspective is this is a good organization. However, they usually leave for numerous combinations of reasoning, and that they lapse. The reason that they lapse is somehow related to that initial perception failing to develop into the reality of the relationship and connection that they expected. So that's why donors leave. Now we'll switch over to what makes a donor stay. So we've gone through those lapses and the takeaways, and that leads us into this question. Okay, we know why they're gone. Why would they have stayed, or what could have made them stay? And this is also Dr. Sargeant's study, and it's been reinforced and echoed through a number of other big names in the industry. Roger Craver at the Agitator, Tom Ahern, can never quite get that one right, who is excellent at messaging. If you've never listened to any of his stuff, I highly recommend it. Same thing with Roger Craver, the Agitator. It's a website that provides a lot of educational information about nonprofits. And even a study by Donor Voice reinforced these loyalty items. So these go straight to what I had referred to as the finger wagging lapse reasons. So the poor service and communication, thanking your donors, reminding them of their support, telling them how the money is being used, and letting them know that their donations mean something. It's important that you communicate, that you share their beliefs and make them aware of the consequences of no longer giving. So these revolve around you letting the donor know their donations mean something to you, the organization, and the mission. And the remaining ones also tie back to the reasons that donors give for ending their support. They especially kind of reinforce the takeaway from earlier that developing a relationship, developing a connection with the organization is important for these donors. So the donor loyalty ones, providing good customer service, communicating, making them aware. Are they learning? We'll get into that one in a little bit, but it's not so much that a donor donates and they already know everything about the mission. There is a group of people who are actively engaged in whatever your mission may be, but they still want to continue to learn. They are invested in it. So being able to continue to teach them, I think, is one of these important parts. Are they learning? So organizing the data. So we've gotten why they leave, what makes them loyal, organizing the data. So it's a pretty simple thing, bringing them together, and now all you have to do is take those 8 lapse reasonings, the 7 characteristics of donor loyalty, and then you can do some additional research on those slight variations that Roger Craver and the Donor Voice survey came out, and just apply them to your nonprofit. So great, that's it. We'll talk to you later. No, I'm just kidding. And just a quick side note, I practiced that, and it's completely dead air around me because everybody's muted. I really have to admire the comedians who do their monologues and stuff now on YouTube, and they have complete dead air around them, because I have no idea if that fell flat. I'm just going to assume it was falling flat, but I'm okay. No, what we are going to do is actually synthesize this a little bit more, and we are going to make it easier to digest and organize. This is where I'm going to bring back those 4 categories from earlier. So organizing the data into trust, commitment, satisfaction, and intimacy. Starting off with trust. It's not uncommon for donors to have no objective way to verify their donation made an impact. I had never really heard this before, but as I was doing the research for this, it did occur to me that, do I see in my donations, do I see services being delivered? In some cases, yes. In many cases, no. So an example would be you may donate to a local river watch, and you can see maybe people cleaning up the river, or you can see an improvement in, the river itself, removing silt, some things like that. But is this the norm? I don't think so. One example is I recently donated to a local sexual assault prevention and care center. I don't know that my donation made an impact other than the reputation of that organization and any communications that they had But even then, it's my trust of that information that goes into whether I felt it was being appropriately used. So this is probably one of the reasons why reputation is such a driving factor in initial giving, like I mentioned earlier. But the important thing to remember is while it may be an initial factor in giving, this is not a one and done kind of effort. You don't get to pass on developing and continuing to reinforce trust simply because it may have been a factor in them donating in the first place. They trusted it that the organization was going to use this, therefore you don't have to continue to develop that. Trust must be continually earned and reinforced through your donor cultivation, your relationship building, and your communications. So you should expect that your donors' trust in your organization increases as they move from a one-time donor to a repeat donor. It seems unlikely that you would have lower trust among your existing donors than your new donors. You've had the opportunity to give them more information than they had coming in. So if you have lower trust with your existing donors, that may be a warning sign that the perception of your organization isn't matching up to the reality once you get into tracking these factors. So the second one is commitment. So this is a concept, it's associated with the dedication that a person has to a cause or an organization and how long into the future that dedication will remain. This is a present and forward-looking concept. There are two types of commitment. There is passive commitment and active/learning commitment. The passive commitment, almost obviously, is a much more tenuous relationship than the other. These are donors who would probably describe themselves as donating because it's the right thing to do. But they may not have that sort of passion that some of your donors would have. And you might think that a passive donor would be more of a new donor concept versus an existing donor concept, but what you need to be very aware of is, especially among sustaining donors, you may have a group that fall into this sort of passive category. And it's important to hopefully identify those. And these may tie back to one of the reasons why they leave, that they didn't even remember giving. Sometimes you'll set up a monthly donation and that's it. You're not more fully engaged in the organization beyond that $10 a month or whatever you may give. So you can have existing donors that have just passive commitment to your organization. So don't think of it just as a new donor problem. The second one, active learning commitment. These are people who have that genuine passion with the mission and the organization. Parts of this type of commitment relate closely to trust. So in that sense, like as an organization, you should be engaging and communicating in a way that the donor is being taken on a journey. They're learning and they're enhancing their connection to the organization. They've already got that desire, that passion, so help them make that a bigger part of their life by these sort of donor journeys. Commitment, important for both new and existing donors. Whether active or passive, for new donors, they need to understand the consequences to your organization if they don't give again. and existing donors need to understand how those are, the consequences. You need to be reinforcing that. Satisfaction. This, while commitment focuses on the dedication to the cause of the mission, satisfaction focuses on basically the quote unquote, the customer service of the organization. You must treat your donors well. Satisfaction is possibly the most important factor in donor loyalty. And while it's common to hear about satisfaction in things like the commercial world, it's not nearly as ubiquitous in the nonprofit sector, and it needs to be. A very satisfied donor is twice as likely to make another gift than a donor who is merely satisfied. And just imagine that with those 32 new donors in that database that I showed you. If they were all satisfied, if you were able to instead get half of them to be very satisfied, it increases the chances that those very satisfied people would have made a second donation by a factor of 2. That is not nothing. That is important. So quickly linking this part back to the Lapse donor responses. Think about how a constituent's satisfaction plays a role in the no information on how the money was being used, no memory of supporting, never getting thanked, poor service and communication. Obviously, satisfaction is important for both new and existing donors and directly relates to those reasons that some donors give for why they leave. And the last one is the intimacy factor. So emotional closeness through shared experiences, beliefs, and caring is an often overlooked element in loyalty, especially in the nonprofit sector. I'm not accusing anybody of that, but as a nonprofit, as somebody who is doing good in the world, there is a deep commitment to the mission. And a lot of times your donors will share that. There is a bond that's created between your constituents, between or among your constituents, between the organization and the constituent. And even in some cases, depending on your mission, the beneficiaries of the mission to the organization and those constituents. So unlike the other measures I've discussed, though, intimacy is not something that you should be expecting from new donors. Intimacy is developed. Intimacy increases over time as the relationship builds. Just like a first date, while you may have excitement, you may have similar interests and goals in life, the intimacy is not there. That is a deeper bond that is only developed with time and connection. So that was all the data. Now I'm going to move on to the actual surveying side of things. So we built engagement surveys with this goal in mind. So surveys are supposed to it's supposed to make it as easy as possible for you to engage with your donor and allow them to give them the opportunity to give you feedback. These are using proven science and research with the surveys so that you can trust the data that is collected is based on professional level questioning. And then we collect that feedback into usable categories, the ones that I've mentioned, so that you can act appropriately on the feedback. The questions in these surveys are the correct questions to use as diagnostic tools to measure trust, commitment, satisfaction, and intimacy. What you'll see here is the Surveys are located in the email. I've got some old screenshots. I apologize. We've got the new icons over to the left, but it's in the email section. You'll see engagement surveys. If you have not set up your surveys, any of your surveys, this is where you'll be taken at first. Otherwise, you will be taken to this one right here. One second, let's drag it over. You'll be taken here, and your surveys will be listed down below. As you can see, we have new donors, existing donors, and lapsed donors as the 3 different types of surveys. Each one is individually configurable. The only thing that you have to do here is configure the survey. In this case, they're all configured, but if you hadn't configured your existing donor survey, there would be a configure button. You would enter that survey. This is where you customize the message, make it tailored to your organization, provide them with a little bit of information. We've given you kind of a template that you can draw upon. You can still use the audit, and then once you've done that, you simply save and activate, or later, if you feel like deactivating, you can come in and deactivate the surveys, and then you're done. Then you can just kind of sit back and wait for the feedback to come in. I will very briefly kind of go through these. These are based off of a 7-point scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree. So a 7 is the highest, the best result that you can get. You can see that we track them over time. So I would have just turned on surveys in February, and I've been tracking them over the past few months. We have different views, the 6 and 12 months. You can see the new and existing donors. In this case, obviously you want these to be trending up. You've been taking action to, if your trust seems a little bit low initially, you can work with better branding, better word of mouth, things to get your new donors to have a higher level of initial trust. But then your existing donors, like I mentioned earlier, should see a higher level of trust because they've gotten to know you better. And then we also collect your lapsed donor responses over here. In this case, 100% of lapsed donors who filled out the survey said that they weren't appropriately thanked for my gift. This is a major failing on my part. So this alone, this one entry here, gives you some feedback to know there is something that you are not doing right. Perhaps you thought you were thanking your donors appropriately. The feedback is telling you that that is not the case with these donors who chose to respond. Other things associated with the surveys in Bloomerang, you can these create interactions on the constituents timeline, so you can do reporting on them. There is a channel purpose combination that will be engagement surveys. The donors who receive, anybody who receives the surveys, if you turn them on, they have the ability to opt out of those, so it is not something that you have to worry about them getting these whether they want to or not. They have the option to turn this off if necessary. And ultimately what you do is then come back to the dashboard after you've received feedback and start tracking your changes. So like I said, these also impact your engagement level. Keep in mind, if somebody answers a survey, even if it's a negative response, they still took the time to answer the survey. That is engagement. That is a person who cared enough to at least provide you with the fact that they had a negative experience. That is very valuable. That is not something to take lightly. So don't just focus on, a survey that, areas that are good. Also, understand that negative feedback is good feedback in a sense. In the surveys, you can see there are responses. What we do is we give you the average as well as the high and the low. So in some cases, the brackets here for having a very high level of integrity, you're running a very small range. In this case, it's a very good range. But in this one has a high level of integrity. It's a much bigger range of, you have some that believe that very much and some that strongly disagree in this sense. Okay, so quick summary of the surveying feature. Turn on the surveys, do the small customization for the email that gets sent, and let Bloomerang do the rest. The 3 surveys that are sent out, these are decades of research by the most probably well-known person in donor retention and loyalty. These are triggered automatically based on specific time frames, based on specific actions, best practices. We're not going to send out, a survey to a new donor as soon as that donation comes in. We will wait the appropriate amount of time. We will make sure that, for example, there might be an acknowledgement that's sent out too. That is important. We don't want to survey somebody before you've even gotten a chance to thank them. So we take those factors into account and only send the survey when it is appropriate. You can opt into each survey, so you don't have to have all 3 of them active. I do recommend that you activate all of them because they all provide different important information for you. Automatic engagement level updates, it's included in the first-time donor retention page, and you can track the responses over time. So here's the last section. I'm going to kind of briefly go through these categories again and give you some ways to tie in the information that you receive from the surveys. With trust, new donors, it's important to be proactive in your new donor onboarding, to detail the outcomes and reinforce your dedication to doing the mission right, to accomplishing these goals. You want them to move beyond the brand that they saw and understand that the people behind it are trustworthy too. The outcomes that you achieve are correct. So all the way back to the beginning, why they give, there's a perception that they're trustworthy. You need to actually solidify that trust. With existing donors, you need to continually remind them how their continued support translates into success. You've established trust with that donor so that the donor gives again. It's important to continue to remind them that you are there, that you are doing good work, that what they provide is an important part of that. So you check that with these lapsed donor responses. If you see something on no info how the money was used, or service-related actions or inactions, that's a sign that maybe they've kind of lost that trust. And you need to put in some sort of new effort to redouble the energy that you're putting into having your donors trust what you are doing. From a commitment perspective, the affinity to the organization, that contributes to that sort of initial donation. But then you need to deepen that commitment using the learning engagement. You need to take them on a journey. You need to give them the nuance of the mission. They may already have a passion for it. You need to fan the flames of that passion. Make them active, committed individuals from the point that they come in. And it kind of ties in directly with existing donors. So keep them engaged, keep them learning, understanding what, if your mission is broad enough that there may be specific categories of it, reinforcing what categories they find most important while not omitting the other parts and keeping them up to date on other areas that they may want to branch into as far as their commitment to the cause. And of course, reinforcing the value of that donation. What happens if they lapse? What happens to the success of your mission should they leave? From the lapsed donor responses, if you are seeing that others are more deserving or thought the charity didn't need them, that would be a hard thing, I think, if you were reviewing lapsed donor responses and you had been putting in effort to do this. But it's important to recognize that at least some people have been having that experience, and you can then pivot to provide that experience, a better experience moving forward. The whole goal is that you don't want to have lapsed donors that have any reason for lapsing other than maybe they can't afford to. And that being the only reason, in which case, maybe that's the part of not being able to afford to that you had no control over. But you want to eliminate those things you have control over to the fullest extent possible. Satisfaction. Thank your donors. This cannot be stressed enough. Thank your donors. Use the first-time donor call list. Call your donor. Leave a message, leave a voicemail message thanking the donor, tying that donation to a specific outcome. Engaging that donor. If they respond to you, you need to be responsive back. If they email you a question, respond back, engage them, give them the customer service that they need. Bloomerang, one of the things that we get the most amount of praise for is our support team, that they are, they answer chats quickly, they answer emails, phone calls. We put in a lot of effort to give the kind of support and service that our customers want. And in a lot of ways, that can forgive lapses in other areas. If you are providing good service to people, they know that you care enough about them that they are willing to potentially overlook even something like an incorrect amount when you thank them, or maybe you accidentally put their gift toward the wrong purpose. All of those little things can be overlooked if you're providing the kind of service that they need. Existing donors, thank them too. Don't think that because they donated before and you thanked them once that they shouldn't be thanked again. They need to know that their donation means something. And lapsed donor responses, you should never see poor service or communication. That is almost entirely within your power. Sometimes there are, things that are outside of your control that could lead to miscommunication, but at least being able to say that you communicated with them and you continued to try to provide them with that service, give it everything you got in that sense. And then the intimacy, again, new donors, they don't have the intimacy yet. So focus on your relationship with your donors as not just being transactional. It's not about the last gift that they get, not just about the last gift that they gave, the next gift that they're giving, when's the next payment coming up. You guys have a tie to a cause, and that should be developed more. You want to have donors know who you are. You want them to be, if I wanted to do this presentation and be less engaging, I wouldn't have my face on the screen. The fact that I have my face on the screen and you can see, me gesticulating and making, when I make a joke and I stand up to go, there's an engagement to that. You should leverage that engagement beyond just their donation and create connections that help bond them to your cause and your organization over the long term, developing that loyalty and retention. You shouldn't see in a lapsed donor response that the charity didn't need me or that they had no memory of supporting. They should always feel needed. They should always know that they'd been supportive of you. If they didn't remember that they supported you, they should be told. They should know because you have been reaching out and letting them know. So in the end, here are some sort of practical things that you can apply. I'd love to be able to do very specific ones for each, tailored for each organization. I found that to be very difficult to do in a specific yet generic enough way. But you can use these surveys to prove to the leadership that what you're doing is working. If you didn't have high levels of trust and you've built that over time, this is a way to prove that what you're doing is working. If you need additional resources, these surveys can be used to show that. If you have a low level of commitment, then maybe your board would be able to allocate additional resources to doing a learning camp or something else that would require resources to help take those donors from just being donors who have an affinity for the cause to being ones who are the actively committed people. It helps identify gaps in your communication efforts. You may very well think that you provide great communication. If these surveys bear out the fact that that is not the case, it's good to know that. It shows that what you thought was good isn't working, and it allows you to pivot. But in the end, this helps you build stronger relationships with your donors. You are not guessing why a new donor is donating to your organization. You are not guessing whether they are committed to the cause, but maybe they don't trust that the money is being used appropriately. You have direct feedback from your actual donors. You do not have to guess. You have it in front of you. And you know why people are leaving. And you can adjust to try to, head off that from occurring.